Hello everybody, welcome. Have you been watching the rest of our sessions, I'm wondering? We've got quite a lot of people here already, but we are expecting some more joining us. In strange ways, this feels far more nerve-wracking than standing in front of everybody in Leeds, because at least there we can see your faces and we can smile and interact a bit, but like this, it's definitely strange times. Hopefully you have made the most of the last 2 days. We've had various sessions live and recorded, and you will have seen that we've had 4 sessions made available this morning. If you've not seen any of them, then they will all stay available for you to watch during the next couple of months. So no rush if you're only able to be with us for this session. And this session being with John Short, our friend and yours. He has been supporting the forum for quite a number of years, too many for me to even begin to calculate. And we know that you value the information that he shares with us, the insights that he has, the knowledge that he imparts to all of us to help make jobs a lot more straightforward. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce John. Let me just quickly mention the questions. He will be having questions during the session. If you have something that you want to ask John, please use the chat feature. I'm going to be monitoring that, and then we're going to be sharing the questions with John throughout the session. Okay, thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy this session. And now I'm going to hand you over to John.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And hello, everybody, and welcome. And I think this is the last session of the July online benchmarking event. I've certainly been involved in a few of the previous sessions and really enjoyed them, and wanted to say a big thank you to Nat, Lisa and Lynn for all the work and support that they put in over the last few days. And I've been really impressed with some of the presentations, the presentation from Lucy, Mark Riddell's presentation and the question and answers, and also the session from Matt and Karen. I think some of the insights that they had about their experiences and the experiences from the young people since 23rd of March or thereabouts was very insightful, some really helpful information. So most of you all know me, John Short, as it says on the kind of label, from the forum, and for some of you, having worked directly with you and visited your authorities. So for me, over the last kind of few months, I've still been working in one of the offices that I do some work with, mainly through March, April and May, as I didn't have any connectivity into that local authority where I was working. So I had a strange few months of being one of the few people in a very large open plan office and helping to manage finance payments, emergency payments, and covering for staff. And one of the things I also wanted to mention was a big thank you to a lot of the admin and business support who've been working over the last few months in the background, as well as the PAs, managers, etc. So there's been a lot of support going in. So what I'd like to cover today is a small number of topics. So I'm going to try and do a very similar theme to what I've done if we were in Leeds and meeting in reality. So I'm just going to try and keep to a small number of topics. So 3 key areas: finance and welfare benefits, accommodation and housing, and some of the regulatory frameworks and practice. What I'm aiming to do is not to kind of go over the detail of what others have already presented, but build on that and give you some space for questions. There's a phenomenal amount of change, phenomenal amount of work going in, and I think we're all trying to kind of interact with it and understand the potential implications going forward. Clearly, it's been a very difficult phase for everybody. We're moving into, in some ways, a more unsure and unclear phase. and there will be lots of implications to unpick. So hopefully we'll go through some of the challenges, etc., some of the key issues. I did want to highlight the whole issue about partnership working and recovery funding. That certainly over the last few months, I'm very conscious that where you've had good joint working arrangements, where the DWP protocol has worked well, that's been key. And going forward, those partnership approaches are going to be a major thing to build on. Lots of information coming out now about recovery funding, Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, DWP, and housing are certainly beginning to put their recovery plans in place, and it will be really important to engage in those care levers, what you need going forward. So the first slide, just touch base, bit of a reminder. So you'll be aware the Stay and Put grant determination letter for this year came out. Again, I think that was a bit lost at times. You'll know that there was an increase of about £10 million in the Stay and Put pot, went up from 23 to 33 million. And on average, it was a 40% increase in the budget across the board. How that worked out for individual authorities was developed in terms of a funding formula linked to fostering numbers of young people, etc. The majority of local authorities increased significantly their budget, but I'm also aware that there was about 12 or 13 authorities have got a lower grant amount. So again, kind of plus and minuses, and that's going to certainly have some implications. Kind of looking through the list, it's worth having a look at the letter and some of the kind of major challenges and some of the authorities that have gained significantly. Just jump out as Croydon, St Helens, and clearly they're likely to have a high degree of looked after children, care leavers, staying put young people. So understandable. The PA 21 to 25 grant determination letter is out there as well, and that's increased from 6 to 9 million. Again, it sets out how that's been worked out. Been a lot of information issued in terms of UASC and asylum seeker funding. There was a letter that came out from Yvette on the 8th of June, and that came out with some guidance on the 10th. And then there was a temporary amendment issued on the 2nd of July. So if you haven't seen them or got them, just Google them and you can find them relatively easy. So the US funding has gone up generally from about 114 a week to 240 a week. There is a link to having, I think it's 0.07%. If you have 0.07% of your looked after population are, if it's less than that, are asylum seekers, you still stick with the 114. So the majority will be getting that increased rate, which will be helpful. Pupil Premium Plus, it's there. I think I can imagine that's been delayed in terms of the rollout, but it now applies up to the age of 19, and it's really for the virtual school and the colleges and leaving care teams to develop their protocols and how it's used. So the virtual school may use some for support, some will go to the colleges, but it needs to be really set out clearly in your local offer. How's that going to work in practice? How are colleges going to use that money? It's not an insignificant amount and will be really helpful in terms of improving education support for young people. Staying close, and the pilots are extending into this new financial year, 3.3 million. Continuation of the pilots and implementation. Again, how that pans out, I think clearly people are going to be busy with COVID and managing that, etc. I'm going to touch on coronavirus support funding, and actually I was on a call pre to this one with a number of housing authorities and a DWP colleague, and what we were all saying was that there is a real complexity and almost a need to list out the different sorts of funding streams, who they apply to, what opportunities there are, and it will be really important to be aware of those and to keep an eye on them. Okay, welfare benefit issues, again, not going to spend lots of time on this, just a bit of a recap. So you'll all know universal credit's been increased for this financial year, £1,040, £20 a week. It is at the moment only till the end of March 2021, and I know it's come out in some of the discussions and some of the forum discussions earlier, yesterday, the day before. It's been really helpful, very helpful for lots of care leavers. The concern is if you're getting used to that and it takes it to a more livable amount, what happens if that's removed? So how's that going to work in practice? So quite a challenge. Doesn't apply necessarily to EEA nationals, NRPF, ARE. And what lots of local authorities have done that I'm aware of is that they've increased their maintenance allowance for the 16 and 17-year-olds. That's been increased by 20%. Lots of local authorities have also increased, sorry, not 20%, by £20. They've increased the allowances that they're providing to ARE, no recourse to public funds, etc., by the equivalent of the UC amount. So that, I think, has been very helpful and will probably be needing to be looked at going forward, particularly if that's really helpful to help young people manage. The benefit cap remains, so particularly with some of the families and young people who are maybe in more expensive private sector accommodation, the benefit cap will still apply. So it may be that it doesn't necessarily always make a difference. We need to think about that. Legacy benefits hasn't been applied to legacy benefits. The presumption was that if you were on employment and support allowance, etc., that you may have been getting a higher rate. So they have only applied it to universal credit. Council tax support, there's been no indications of waiving it or kind of reductions, and in many ways it's much more critical to local authority funding because the anticipation is that the income from council tax support will go down. All very well if you've got a council tax exemption scheme for care leavers, but if you've got young people in areas where there isn't an exemption scheme, need to kind of keep thinking about how that's managed. Local housing allowance, the rates again have increased more than they would have done this financial year, and we need to be aware that in March next year they may drop those back. I think it will depend how the economy goes in the next few months and how young people are managing and what the recovery plans are, but again, things to be aware of. And in terms of unemployment, I do quite a lot of work with housing departments, and they're already beginning to get worried about people being made redundant, that people who were covering their rent, private sector rent, and who are no longer getting the levels of rent because of the benefit cap, or their rent was above the LHA rates, and people are beginning to struggle to manage those payments. DHPs are there, discretionary housing payments are there as a kind of key fallback. Budget has been announced that's 180 million. That's managed by each of the housing local authority areas, but it's really important to start talking to your colleagues who manage that. Can you get some of the access to that for care leavers? DWP protocols, and partnership managers. I'm conscious that the process of claiming benefits, you see resolving tensions. I've actually found it easier in authorities that I've been working in since COVID kicked in. DWP have been really focused on supporting clients. In many ways, I've seen care leavers PAs, etc., finding it easy to claim. But I think some of that is dependent on whether you've got a good working relationship with your local DWP. So make contact with your partnership managers if you haven't. That will pay dividends. And I think going forward, DWP are starting to look at grants that would have been in terms of supporting people into work. They're now starting to talk about supporting people to overcome the barriers into work. So they're recognising that there are going to be challenges going forward. Local authority approaches, emergency support. Karen talked about, Matt talked about some of the support they're working on and that they've provided. Lucy talked about that, and Mark gave examples. I mean, I've seen some brilliant examples of kind of food parcels, e-vouchers, developing accounts with Asda and Aldi and all sorts of people so that young people could turn up for food parcels and choose what they needed. What I've certainly picked up is that young people have valued, the food parcels, the kind of a kind of goodie bag approach, and it's been those things that have been really helpful and made a difference. So there's been a lot of flexibility, and grants and money are part of that. But I think personal support, something that builds on the support from the PA, etc., has been probably as important. Again, all changing now as kind of lockdown ends and people can get out and about a lot more. But yeah, some really good examples of flexibility and things that have worked in practice.
We've had some questions coming in already. For those who have joined a little bit after we've started, if you have questions for John, please just use the Q&A function and Lisa will go to publish them and then I'll ask them. But there will be another 2 opportunities to ask questions of John in amongst his slides. To kick things off, we've got Liz from Cumbria. Staying put, is there a rule that says we have to increase payment by a certain amount? And is there any benchmarking about what areas are paying across the country?
As far as I'm aware, I think various local authorities have tried to benchmark with their neighbours. I've certainly seen that with a number of local authorities trying to do that. The guidance hasn't changed. So what the guidance says is that each local authority needs to publish a policy and set out what it pays to carers, but it is down to the discretion of the individual local authority as to how they manage that. I think one of the tensions is that a lot of local authorities are already spending over what they get from the last year's Staying Put grant. So the increased pot may help to kind of reduce the overspend on Staying Put. But it doesn't set out that you have to kind of manage that. And I've come across local authorities who are thinking, well, if we've got a bit more money, would it be helpful to have a Staying Put coordinator to manage some of the processes and support young people to claim benefits, etc. So it's at the discretion of the local authority how it manages it. But again, it's kind of thinking about how does it align with your fostering rates, IFAs, etc. So again, it's something that there was always a view that DFE would need to review the Staying Put guidance and the policy and the approach, and maybe that'll come a bit further down the line.
Thank you, John. I realise that a second part of the question might be a bit more directed to NLCBF in terms of what benchmarking has taken place around that issue. Liz, I know that you're unable to join us for a benchmarking exchange, but I've seen on my screen Lisa scribbling away your point, and maybe we'll find a way to bring that into our benchmarking exchange sessions over the next 2 weeks, and possibly it will come up in conversation and we'll be able to do something benchmarking virtual style in the coming weeks.
Just to come back on that, I think it would be helpful to start kind of benchmarking what authorities are providing. It's quite a complicated exercise because sometimes it's a combination of fee and maintenance allowance, and then there's changes whereby a young person might pay some rent to the carer. In other authorities, they pay the rent to the local authority in a sense. So I think it would be useful to do the benchmarking, but we need to be very clear on the terms of reference, so it's a realistic comparator.
And it'd be useful to work with you on that, John. I suppose that's why we sometimes come up with interesting flip chart sheets at the back of the room in Leeds to help people sort of piece that information together. And it's slightly harder to do virtually, but not impossible. And we get our heads together on that one.
Very keen to help with that. Very keen to help.
Thanks, John. The second question is, can the PA 21 to 25 funding allocation information be shared, please?
Yeah, more than
sorry.
Yeah, more than happy to circulate that. If you need the leaflet and you kind of want to have a read over the weekend, just go on to Google and put in PA grant determination letter 21 to 25 and it will come up. But after this session I'll email the link to Nat and Lisa and then they can email that out. But yeah, it's a kind of 6 million up to 9 million. What
we'll do is when we download this recording and launch it on the website, we'll include that link so that you've got it. But we will try and follow up on that. I think that's the last of the questions for now. I'm sure the question section will kick in to a flurry later on as you get more into your content, John, but I'll leave you to progress with your next slide.
Okay, so onto the next slot. Two slides on housing. So again, just before lockdown, some of you will have been involved in the sessions and the relaunch of the St Basil's framework. So I think part of the reason for raising it is we can't lose sight of the development work that needs to go on, the joint housing protocols, DWP protocols, and in many ways, the more you've got those protocols embedded, the more partnership working. We kind of need to think about that going forward. So you're not competing, but you're working with housing, working with DWP, because a lot of the funding will be linked to partnership approaches and how that works in practice. So Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, they endorsed the framework and did some of the launches that you'll remember back in January, February with the youth homelessness team, Kim and colleagues. Ministry of Housing are also working on developing some guidance on joint housing protocols and what local authorities should cover. I've seen a draft version and that's been really helpful. So again, just emphasising the kind of need to get those developed locally, and probably more important now when there are going to be more and more pressures on housing. So the next bullet point, this COVID-19 Ministry of Housing, when COVID hit, Ministry recommended that each local authority set up these kind of local homelessness networks, hubs, accommodation cells, whatever you call them. Each area kind of had a slightly different focus. I take part in one as I kind of manage, I work in a large two-tier authority and kind of manage the relationship between children's services and housing. So I sit on that as the children's services rep. And it was suggested that the partnership should be representation from each of the housing departments, children's services, adult services, health in the broadest sense, CMHT, etc., public health, probation, DWP, and key partners. And the one I've taken part in also has Ministry of Housing on, and they've been really critical forums. So we've met weekly, it's all been online, and we've now got a second part, which is a recovery process, and each of the housing departments are beginning to develop their recovery plans. It would be really important to get involved or link to your children's services rep who is involved in those cells. They will be working up the recovery plans. They'll be looking at the intentionally homeless families. it links to the next point that you'll remember from the kind of days back at the end of March, early April, everyone in. So there was a real push across housing to get all of the rough sleepers off the streets, not just the rough sleepers, but those who were safe surfing. In the authority I've worked in, that has picked up about 50 rough sleeping care leavers, safe surfing care leavers. About 50% of those were under 25, about 50% were over 25, and we're now looking at how we keep that group of people, whether it's the care leavers, other rough sleepers, off the streets, and a lot of the single people link into adult services, substance misuse, mental health difficulties, etc. And I've picked that up in other local authorities, that it's a really good source of information in terms of trying to re-engage with some of the most complex and difficult care leavers. So as part of that partnership group, DWP are there, and we're beginning to look at, can we identify some pots of money that will help to fund moves into the private sector. Can we look at floating support? And DWP again were highlighting that they're a complex, they're a vulnerable group. If we can put some information together about it's overcoming the barriers to employment, it's kind of making sure that we're very clear what the money's for, etc. Again, financial support, I find a real complexity. There are lots of different pots of money that are around. Conscious that I was on a call last couple of days ago, huge amounts of capital funding, huge amounts of revenue funding, whether it's enough in terms of housing, emergency assistance grants. So I think there's a piece of work to be done in your local area, and nationally, looking at what are the kind of grant pots that are available, what's the conditionality, can we apply for care leavers? Some of them are going to be for charities and community groups who might be supporting care leavers. Can we enable them to apply for pots of money, etc.? But going forward, there is going to need to be a lot of work done. I'm very conscious, again, in one district that I do some work in, they housed 100 people, quite a small district, not a big one. There's a big piece of work in terms of how you then provide an enduring solution. A lot of them ended up in hotels. There's been lots of difficulties in terms of whether that's been manageable, and again, some people have stayed, some have gone back on the streets, but it's going to be an ongoing challenge, and some of the most complex care levers to kind of fit within that framework. Protection from evictions, again, you'll be familiar with this. This kind of came out back in end of March, early April. It kind of applies mainly to general needs accommodation, so it's very much looking at avoiding rent arrears if people were furloughed, redundant, etc., couldn't afford the rent, that there shouldn't be any evictions. That comes to an end on the 23rd of August. I'm just looking for the exact dates. I think it's 23rd of August. From discussions with lots of housing authorities, people may still be racking up rent arrears. I've seen that families have still been made intentionally homeless. They may not have been asked to leave the accommodation, but all of that work will still be going on in the background. So again, there's a need to do some joint work. Where are we at? So I think people are anticipating that around the 23rd of August, there will suddenly be a kind of huge momentum and potentially quite an increase in evictions, and we'll start to see the numbers of homeless, etc., going up. The protection from evictions doesn't really apply to supported accommodation, excluded tenants and licences. What the government have always said, and housing would say, and those providers, we need to provide extra support to young people, prevent evictions wherever possible, give extra warnings if needed. But ultimately, tenants in supported accommodation aren't protected from that evictions possibility, and I've certainly seen supported accommodation providers who've done everything they can to prevent that happening, but where young people haven't been complying with lockdown, have been inviting friends back, so some of the more complex young people, and they've struggled with loneliness, they've struggled with that isolation. I haven't seen many, but it does happen, and it has happened, so all quite unfortunate. I think housing have had a really difficult time in many ways. What I've seen with housing is that they've experienced much more of a challenge, particularly in the early days, than we may have done in children's social care, not to underplay the difficulties that children's social care have had, but creating increased capacity, bringing people off the streets, creating isolation accommodation in case people did get COVID and then needed to be moved around, temporary accommodation, massive amounts of work in terms of drawing hotels in as emergency accommodation. Ministry of Housing were very clear that 16, 17-year-olds shouldn't be put into emergency accommodation that's hotels. So again, lots of that joint working. Some of the kind of opportunities, I've already had some conversations with some housing authorities where they've identified hotels who probably aren't going to recoup the level of business that they had previously, are starting to talk to housing authorities about, could we become a temporary supported accommodation provision for some of the rough sleepers, some of the families. So there may be examples there where there might be some more accommodation comes online. There might be more opportunities in the private sector, depending on how the market goes. But it's very early days. Initially, kind of lettings dropped, there was very little movement, social landlords were needing to clean properties and deep clean them, so there was a much slower throughput in terms of lettings into supported accommodation. That's beginning to free up. I've seen a lot more movement from the work that I do. So care leavers are now getting offers, there are move on options, but still a much more difficult process, and people need support. Care leavers are going to need support through that process. Lots of delayed moves, young people staying with their staying put carers, young people staying in supported accommodation, and that has created tensions in terms of then others not being able to move into that place. So the kind of throughput, I think, has been quite a challenge. It will have increased budgets with staying put, challenges with foster carers, conscious that many connected person carers are often family, grandparents, isolation, etc., etc. So I think quite a challenge in that sector, and going forward, it is very early days. The housing sector is beginning to open up, so I think although we're over a kind of more imminent challenging phase, the next stage is going to present a lot of challenges. We know employment, housing, etc. So things may have been in one way easier because we knew where we were, it was locked down, this is what you do. This next phase is a bit more unknown, but there are opportunities finance wise, and we need to try and make use of those, particularly the partnership approaches. Okay, so I'm going to stop at that point, and I'm going to open up again for more questions.
The next question I've got for you is from Maggie from North Yorkshire, and it's is the staying put grant ring fenced?
As far as I know, it isn't, and I'd be really keen to check that with Mark Riddell. My understanding is that it isn't ring fenced. I think there's an encouragement to use it for staying put, and I think there's an expectation that that's what it will be used for. I would want to check that. and confirm that, and I'm trying to scrape me bits of paper together because I've got a copy of it somewhere on my table.
Well, don't worry too much about scraping the bits of paper. What we had Mark Riddell obviously on Wednesday for his live event, and then we did a small focus group. But Mark has actually has said that he's open to coming to try and attend our benchmarking exchange sessions over the next 2 weeks. We're not sure how many he'll be able to make, but hopefully he can make a couple and we can try and pose the question there. If not, Lisa will, I'm sure, pick up the question with Mark after this meeting.
I think that'd be really helpful if we can just, and I'll have a look, if we can clarify. I just don't want to make a definitive statement because I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it isn't ring fenced.
Well, especially since this session's been recorded and we put it out live after the event, so we'll try and be sure about the information that we share here. The next question is Sue from East Ridings. Hello again, Sue. Is there any statutory requirement on landlords and housing to deep clean flats before new tenants move in at the moment?
Again, it's about making sure that there's a risk assessment, that it's safe and appropriate. My understanding from all of the social landlords that I've been working with is that they are doing that. That's something they're doing. Again, I want to go through the detail of the guidance to make sure, but if somebody isn't doing that, it would be worrying. So I know, again, a lot of social supported accommodation providers, that's been a problem, that it's taken them 3 or 4 days to do a deep clean on the rooms, and they are disposing a lot of soft furnishing types of things. So that's been one of the things that's kind of created the delay in reopening the rooms. But again, I kind of want to check the detail of that. It's quite a helpful question, so thanks, Sue. Useful.
That's a very interesting question. Thanks for that, John. That's the last of the questions. Just a quick plug from us before you start again. You mentioned developing joint housing protocols, and for those that might have missed it, a couple of weeks back for our practitioner event, we published a pre-recording of a presentation from Jill and Samad from Ministry of Housing and Local Government, covering joint housing protocol, where they're up to with those kind of things, and lots of helpful links to help local authorities. So go back through our news and you will find a link to that that video in the YouTube channel. Okay, I think we'll move on to the next slide, and I'll disappear again, John.
Okay, thanks, Nat. Thanks, Lee. So just wanted to touch briefly on some of the kind of guidance changes to regulations and practice, and again, conscious from the session that Karen and Matt did of how phenomenal people have been adapting, adjusting, changing, and trying to work through this kind of difficult time and challenging time, and how well people have done. I know we would have preferred not to, and I'm sure we'd have preferred to be in Leeds, but it has been quite a challenge and people have done really well with it, technology, etc, etc. So just wanted to touch on some of those points. Care Leavers Covenant, hopefully you've all seen the fact sheets that have come through, so that picks up some of the points about accommodation benefits, really helpful for staff, for young people. Reiterating the point about support for young people, staff and carers, that there's been a lot of flexibility. I think quite a challenge going forward. So where technology has worked great, you know, there's been Teams meetings with young people. My experience of that has been that it works well if you've got young people with a good a pre-existing relationship with a PA, but if it's a start off, it's quite a challenge. I think some young people have really missed out in terms of wanting direct support. So it's been very varied, but equally, I think there's almost something about we were all in it together at the beginning in April, May, etc. and that in itself was a challenge, but things are less clear now. The kind of lockdown is less clear. People are beginning to realise that we're in this for the long term. So what are the rules now? What's the expectations? And I think that's certainly beginning to have an impact on staff, young people, and we need staff to be able to support young people, etc., and carers. So I think challenging times going ahead. I'm aware of some online training that Lisa Cherry had put together that DFE were promoting about managing the mental health and well-being of young people. It's kind of relatively easy working from home in some ways, but having that separation between work, home, etc., I think can be quite a challenge for some workers. Positives and negatives, and I think going forward, I've certainly found it really useful when I've been talking to housing colleagues, whereas previously you'd drive half an hour for a meeting. Just having a quick meeting for 10 minutes covers the same issue, so it can speed things up and kind of improving back and forward, so different challenges. In terms of the temporary changes and the kind of interim arrangements to the regulations, they came in on the 24th of April and they are there till the 25th of September. The intention was that it would give extra flexibility and was very much focused on the care planning guidance, the children's homes regs, fostering regs, adoption regs. It only touched on leaving care really, and it was about saying you can have more flexibility, but you still need to, wherever possible, stick to the pathway plan review timings, the visits timings. You might be able to do some visits online and through phones and seeing people through computers, etc., but still think about the safe and well. So some of the more vulnerable young people who may not have complied with lockdown as well as we would have hoped to, they are likely to be increasing their vulnerability just because COVID's out and we're being more respectful and being much more careful. You know, there are others who are exploiting that. So in some ways there are more risks for young people as well. So we kind of need to be mindful of that. I think there's something really important about everybody staying safe, looking after each other, workers, young people, carers, and partners. It's easy to fall out with housing if they don't necessarily have the housing stock that you need, etc., etc. So there's a real importance in these times to work in partnership and manage that process. So the changes are temporary and they give you some powers to be flexible with the requirements. But if you are being flexible, then make sure you've got an audit trail of why. So if you haven't visited within due time scales, it's helpful to just have an explanation in case notes as why that's happened, should something happen a bit further down the line. I've highlighted a few points towards the bottom. Care leavers with additional needs, they might be being held in children with disabilities teams, transitions teams, adult services. Those with mental health and well-being, people who are detained in hospital, are going to probably be there longer than they were. We still need to think about the capacity assessments. There's still care leavers. Those with learning disabilities and difficulties, not necessarily in the mainstream leaving care teams, physical disabilities, etc. I do some work with a special school that also has some looked after children, and have spent a couple of days learning about PPE for aerosol generating procedures. And you know, for some of that complex needs group, there are much bigger challenges, and again, some of the leaving care budget, some of the support still needs to be there for them, and likewise those coming out of custody, unaccompanied asylum seekers, extra pressures, lockdown, young people who are parents with children and might be a bit more isolated. We know it's a very diverse group of young people. One size isn't going to fit all. I've seen brilliant examples of support, flexibility. that young people have appreciated and have really valued, and going forward we need to build on that. We need to think about what are some of the things that have worked really well for young people. How could we replicate that? But how, you know, when do we do electronic or virtual meetings if it's at a distance, but when do you need to actually go that distance because you need to create a real meeting with different partners, etc. So I think it poses lots of questions going forward, lots of challenges, and certainly what I've seen, people have really stepped up to the plate, and there's been some brilliant work done. Similarly, kind of staying connected with Benchmarking Forum. I've missed the Leeds meeting. I'd love to be in Leeds today. But people have worked it out and have done some brilliant work. So I think well done to everybody involved. So a bit of a preamble. So on to the next slide and some final questions, or if there's any questions that relate to the earlier section, more than happy to try and pick that up.
We've got a question here. What is a reasonable cut-off age for a leaving care grant?
I think in terms of the policies I write for different authorities and where people seem to be coming from is up to 25 now. So would have been 21 with the extended duty up until 25. So if somebody hasn't used all of it at 21 and they're waving the authority goodbye, should really be in their final pathway plan. If you're then moving from supported into independent accommodation, you need to come back to access the rest of the grant. So be it, and that again would be part of that extended duty up to 25.
Thank you, John. There's an alarm going on a car outside my house. I hope that's not coming through into the event and distracting people, but it distracted me for a second. We've got a question from Suzanne. Comment made by John earlier about the government announcement funds and resources and care leavers. Intentions announced, not necessarily seeing the funds. How do we keep track, as you commented upon earlier?
I think that is a real challenge because there are lots of announcements, and there's something about kind of DFE announcements, DWP, Ministry of Housing, and maybe it's something that the kind of benchmarking forum can help to collate some of those different pots of money, and some are very specific. So I've kind of seen pots of money that are just for probation to use, health to use. Some will go to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government for accommodation, housing and homelessness, but some care leavers who are rough sleepers would fit in within that parameter. So it's a challenge in terms of working out the different pots. I would hope each local authority, and it's probably the bigger authorities, will be on top of it, of trying to collate what pots of money there are around and making sure that there are bids from them. A lot of the initially, where you had a two-tier authority, a lot of the monies came into the upper tier that was then divvied out to some of the districts and boroughs, and that created quite a lot of tensions. And I think the second tranche, the big tranches through lockdown, then some of that was directed straight to the districts, the boroughs. It's a complicated piece of work, and it almost needs a collation of what's out there, what's the eligibility criteria, and how do we link into it. So again, I think that's something for individual authorities and regions to do. Thank you, John.
This is more of a comment, but related to staying put and ring fencing. Sue from East Ridings. Grants are not ring fenced. I'm having to make a clear case as to why the staying put and post 21 grants should still come to my service. A big concern given the local authority deficits overall.
Yeah. And the grant letter, which I've managed to find and will circulate, it's it sets out that the grant is for supporting staying put arrangements and the costs incurred by local authorities in respect of young people post 18. It's not clear either way, but my understanding is that it's not ring fenced, but we will clarify.
Thank you, John. Natasha asks, do you know whether those young people who are 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 able to receive Section 95 support, or is this still on hold? We've been continuing to support ARE young people for this reason.
Again, I think it's been raised as to an outstanding piece of work is very much the clarity. So the Immigration Act 2016 came in, the guidance associated with it has still to be released, and it was that guidance that would clearly set out when is a failed asylum seeker, when do they move to Home Office support. I think the PA up to 25 again opens up some of that challenge around the Barking judgment, that if somebody is a former relevant young person, can they still request a service? So for me, that whole clarity around ARE, failed asylum seekers, is something that really needs to be pinned down. I think it would be really helpful to try and work with DfE Home Office on a future benchmarking event to try and be as clear as we can about the interaction of different parts of ARE asylum funding.
Thank you. Will the government ever increase the 2,000 setting up home allowance? This is a fair question for you, John. But
I'd hope so. I think it's fair to say I often do my preamble at the start and say that I've worked in leaving care for 27 years. Kind of in May just gone, I started as an aftercare coordinator, and I can remember for years and years and years DfE wouldn't want to put parameters around local authorities. They would say that, you know, there needs to be flexibility, and I guess over time they've moved slightly, so the HE bursary, £2,000 over the course over the life of the course, the recommended amount of the setting up home grant being £2,000. I think again it's how you define it, because if it's £2,000 and that covers the cost of some removals, getting a cooker fitted by an approved electrician, your first TV license or contents insurance, £2,000 doesn't necessarily go that far. So I think there's more vehicles now to try and get some of that guidance from the DfE in terms of what's the minimum. And I think again, Young Persons Benchmarking Forum, young people highlighting what do they think is a reasonable amount to furnish accommodation, and going forward there probably are going to be challenges on local authority funding, and we are going to have to keep putting the flag up for care leavers. And it's not just a case of don't reduce what's being provided. We all know, you know, the question about staying put, how much local authorities spend on staying put and how much they get in grant. There's often a mismatch, and it's the same with setting up home. The majority of local authorities are spending more than £2,000 on supporting young people to set up in accommodation. So
thank you.
One of my usual long-winded answers, I would hope that they would increase it.
Thank you, John. And I know that in one of the benchmarking sessions, a manager raised that leaving care grants were made to go further by the availability of charity and second-hand furniture, and that's just not been a possibility recently. So there's been lots of first-hand buying, which is an even bigger challenge for many. We've got a question from Darren. Will the increase in universal credit from £20 last until April next year?
Yes, so it's scheduled to end at the end of March 2021. So in effect, it's there. I haven't heard anything about whether it will be extended, but I think it will be very challenging for a lot of people, and I think there will be a lot of lobbying to say, particularly if employment increases, that it will be needed. But in addition, I think what you'll probably see a lot of pressure on is people who are in the private sector who have been made redundant, claiming universal credit, and the gap between what they would get in the housing element or local housing allowance, the benefit cap, and it not necessarily covering their rent, I think will put a lot of pressure on going forward. And I can see that being a pressure to say, actually it's going to be needed for longer, but at the moment the commitment ends at the end of March 2021.
Thank you, John. I know that it'll be a key ask of, especially I think Mark Riddell mentioned it on Wednesday for the cross-ministerial board that's taking place next week, and I know that Young People's Benchmarking Forum will be making an ask of this in their slot at that meeting. Lisa, I'm noticing we're on time. I'm looking for, are we running over? I'm looking for a nodder of a head, because we don't normally not run over, but we've got a couple more questions. We're going to try and run over for 5 minutes to the 42 people who are still on the call. So we've got a couple more questions here that I'll ask of John, if that's okay with you. Yeah. We've got Gary. Can you expand on the duty of social services regarding emergency housing for young people post 21 who have opted in but are considered intentionally homeless by the local authority housing department?
Again, I think that's a challenge in terms of the Barking and Dagenham judgment talked a bit about the responsibility to form a relevant young people, but that was in the context of asylum seekers. What I see is increasingly local authorities supporting either directly by the provision of accommodation or funding of it for 18 to 21-year-olds. And often it's a second opportunity into supported accommodation or deposits and rent in advance into the private sector. There isn't an explicit duty that you have to provide accommodation, but I think most authorities recognise that care leavers are really vulnerable. They're trying to work with their housing departments. So if somebody's made IH, can the young person get a second opportunity? If they've demonstrated a change, can they go back into supported accommodation? So it kind of needs to be a flexible approach, and I've certainly seen authorities where young people are coming back 21 to 25, have lost their accommodation, and those authorities are the PA 21 to 25 is saying that, you know, we're going to help you to try and get back into the private sector, and we'll provide deposit rent in advance, or we'll help you to get a bed into the YMCA. And the YMCA may then have a quota of tenancies from that housing authority, so the young person might get a second go into their own tenancy. It's a complicated, so it's more of a power rather than a duty.
Thank you, John. I'll give you one comment on setting up home grants. Apparently, this is from Karen Bazell from a recent regional forum that Mark Riddell attended. He's proposing to government an increase to 4,000. So that's his ask. And then a very and this might need to be a quick fire answer to a quick fire question. Do we know anything more about bedroom tax? Is it getting increasingly more difficult to find one bedroom properties?
The one change that is coming through is that the shared room rate will be extended for care leavers up to 25. So care leavers will be able to get the one bedroom rate all the way up to 25, but that doesn't come in till October 23.
Thank you, John. That's it. You've got through all the questions. I said there'd be a flurry at the end. I'm going to hand over now to Lisa for some final thoughts.
Thanks very much, everybody, and hopefully we'll meet again in Leeds shortly. Take care.
I know that everybody's busy, and we did say that we would be finished by 2 o'clock, but I just want to say a quick thank you again to John for all his hard work, because it's not just this bit of the session, it's all of the research he does beforehand, and then at the moment it's all of the work that we're doing behind the scenes to bring this to you in our new virtual format. I want to say thank you to Nat and to Lynn massively, because only yesterday, both of them, their work computers decided to stop working. So they're both streaming today from their own computers that they've had to sort everything out. So it's been a bit of a double whammy today. And I want to say thank you to all of you for giving up your time to fit this in. I know that you're all very busy, and in this ever-changing world, that you all keep safe. Please, please, please fill in our evaluations, even more so now than ever before. We need to know what you think. Some of this may have worked for you, some of it might not work for you, and we really need to know, because we're hoping to bring November to you in Leeds at this moment in time, but we're looking at lots of different alternatives for how we can deliver, maybe hybrid events or virtual events, or hopefully again one day in-person events. So we need to hear from you, so please, please, please do send us some feedback. And if you haven't looked at all the sessions that we've put on up to now, please do look at them. And I'm going to go because I've now overrun by a minute. And thank you and goodbye.